Okay, so a new episode of Serial where we'll talk about the photos taken or modified the months before, that is January 2023. And because this presentation is going to be pretty long compared to usual ones, I will subdivide starting by digital photography first, and then second part will be films galore with lots of films and cameras that I have tested during the month. So first two images, that's Oslo, early January. I think it's actually the 1st of January, using a SL2 body and an old lens I like to use, meant for M mounts, a Summicron 50mm f2. Picture on the left, that's when you take the train from, for those who know Oslo, when you take the train from the airport from Gardermoen and go to the center of the city, trying to experiment a little bit at that point. Same thing here, using the SL2. When I travel, I try to get some ambiances. When I like an image, I try to capture something. I try not to have it be too overwhelming on my trips and my real life experience, but a few pictures. I always have some camera near me, and that's the SL2 with a Summarit-M 90mm. Both those pictures. On the left, that's a building, a hotel building. I like the lights and the colors in the rooms. And on the right, that's the Bay of Oslo. This really modern rendering of Summarit-M lenses, which I personally love. Very smooth bokeh, very precise, great color rendering. Very modern look to me. Oslo again. On that trip, I was planning to try and get more acquainted with the lens I've used in the past, but it's the Lomography LomoArt Lens Atoll 17mm f2.8 lens. Very compact, quite budget friendly for what it does. Good aperture for that kind of lens, and the rendering is actually very interesting in my opinion. Again with the SL2. And yeah, a bar in Oslo on the right, and a street scene. Basically, I kind of like. I was experimenting a little bit with the rendering of this lens, and trying to get really more acquainted and better know how to use it. Here again, Oslo in the blizzard. Two pictures taken with the SL2 and the Summarit-M 90mm f2.5 lens. Again, very specific rendering of this lens, which I really like. I like those Summarit lenses, either M or S. Great rendering to me. Then we go to something more experimental. That's in Zurich. And this is a Domiplan V or 5 lens, 30mm f3.5 lens made by Meyer Optik, which was actually custom extracted from a camera which was the Penti, made by Welta in Germany in the 1950s, late 50s. It was a very popular camera at the time, and this lens had a good reputation for its rendering. And somebody adapted it because you can adapt those kinds of lenses. You can extract them from a camera and adapt them for modern cameras, for example. Has been done for some cameras, for example, where the mechanics are completely broken, but the lens is still good. They will extract the lens and make it mountable. And in that case, I got this lens and adapted it on the SL2. It's not the image projection is not going to be wide enough for the full frame sensor to be really nice. You'll have some black periphery, but it's good for APS size surface. And on most modern cameras, you have a mode where you can shoot with a smaller format like APS. On the SL2, you have it. It makes it for a pretty comfortable experience, and the raw file still has a periphery. But that's two examples. That's south of Lake Zurich. Again, that's in Zurich. Same equipment, same lens. Actually, really precise. I kind of like the rendering. I was quite surprised for that kind of lens. How interesting the rendering is. A little old school, but works well in my opinion. And as I said before, APS, the surface projection from this lens is actually good for APS, but I will maybe call that APS plus. I don't know, but it's good for the surface of the long size of the APS format. So you can actually do APS size square, and that's what you get when you square up the surface. And actually, it's a very interesting, creative thing to do. I kind of liked it, working in square format. And yeah, interesting. I'll probably do a video about this this lens, this extracted lens, and about custom-made lenses, recycled lenses. Here we're going to something else, a camera I really like. For those who know my work, I like to work with this Pentax series of camera, very tiny cameras with interchangeable lenses. That's the QS-1, the last camera Pentax made at the time. And with the zoom lens, the 06, which is a 15 to 45 f2.8 lens, linear, equivalent to a 70 to 210 millimeter lens for full frame. Great lens with inside the lens shutter. You have image stabilization on the body, and you have this really specific, very characteristic grain in low lights, like you can see on the right. It's just a camera you can have in your pocket with those characteristics. No other camera can do that. So it's a really great format. I really wish, and I'm not the only one, that Pentax would create would reproduce a new model of the Q series with a more modern sensor. Really great camera. And again, same camera, but testing the 03 lens, which is a fisheye, the 3.2 millimeter fisheye. I don't know exactly what the equivalent lens that would be, but probably something like a 15 millimeter fisheye. I don't know. And it's f5.6, so here the sensor is a little bit at its limits. For what it is in terms of sensitivity, but I tried to experiment with the lens and see if I could do something about it. Really super compact lens, and because the camera is super compact, it just feels like a toy camera, but interesting result in my opinion. Not very satisfactory, but there's something probably to do with it. Here, switching to, I'm rushing a bit because the presentation is pretty long. You might want to look at it in two parts, but here I was experimenting with a camera I've never tried, and actually a sensor, a type of sensor I've never tried, the Foveon X3 sensor from Sigma. That's a Sigma DP2X camera, all-in-one non-interchangeable lens camera. But this sensor has for those who don't know, instead of having the color pixels one next to each other, red, green, and blue, for example, it has different layers with the colors. So you actually don't have the need for a Bayesian grid, and you don't have the need for the transformation and artifacts that come out with. So there's definitely, everybody says that Foveon sensors have a different rendering and look more like film. I wanted to try. I found this old Sigma DP2X camera, and actually I'm pretty impressed. I'm not really sure of the quality objectively, but it's got 14 something megapixels, but in 3 layers. So it's basically a 4.6, 4.7 megapixel output image size, basically 2600 on by 1800. It's not very sensitive. It's basically 100 ISO to 3200 ISO, and very noisy, very grainy when you go up. But really interesting rendering. I was pretty surprised. If you push the sensor, as I usually like to do to see where I can go, here on those 2 images, you can see that you really get some weird, the grain is not the same, the noise is not the same, the color rendering is definitely different. So really a very different feel to it if you push the sensor. And overall, I'm going to try a little bit more. You can find reflex cameras from Sigma which have the same sensor, or basically the same technology, for really cheap. So I got myself one to test, and I'll see what I can get out of this kind of sensor. Here, going back to one of my most beloved cameras, and the Leica M8 with its APS-H sensor, the only non-full frame digital M series camera from Leica, and using the Lomography Lomo LC-A Minitar 1 art lens. This lens originating in the Lomo LC-A camera from the 1980s, except because the sensor is a little smaller. It's a lens made for a full frame camera, but using the APS-H sensor, you don't have as much of the artifact in the periphery, but you still have the strong character of the lens. Actually, a very cool combination, in my opinion. M8 plus Lomo LC-A Minitar 1. That's a really interesting photographing experience. And here are two results giving you an idea in a snowy day in Geneva. Again, this month I've been trying a few digital cameras from the early days when they were experimenting with sensors and ergonomics. And that's it's kind of a trend right now. If you look online, lots of people are reviving digital cameras from the early days because they have a very different rendering. So I love digital matter, matière numérique. So I'm happy that it's becoming a trend right now, using those old sensors that really have a different rendering, and that's a Sony DSC F828 super-CCD sensor camera. Very strange camera. It was really probably the best camera in the line at the time from Sony. It's got a red, green, blue, and emerald color sensor, a CCD sensor, a super CCD sensor. Basically, 4 colors instead of 3 for a better rendering. It was 8 megapixel at the time. I think it's a camera from 2003 or something like that. And it's also got very high infrared sensitivity and an infrared flashlight for night photography too. Very weird camera. And also with an incredible lens, Carl Zeiss T 28 to 200 millimeter equivalent, f2.0 to f2.8 lens. So I was trying this, and that's two of the first results I got with the camera. It's got a weird body too, with a swiveling body, and basically you hold the lens and you swivel the body, not the screen. Super interesting, and the rendering, quite surprised. Color rendering and the grain, and I'm gonna do some more experimenting with this camera, but that's two of the first experiments I did. Again, for a video that maybe is already out. I'm not sure anymore in what order I'm publishing the videos, but that's a Holga lens for Canon, and it's on a Canon EOS 7D camera, because this lens is basically a toy lens to put on a Canon EOS camera, but it it's meant for an APS-C sensor surface. You'll have all the mini hole visible in the periphery with a full frame sensor. So, two examples of that really interesting rendering. Artistically very interesting lens, super cheap. But yeah, that's two pictures I was working on for this presentation last month. Again, lots of different weird things that I've been using last month. That's on the SL2 body, so this 47 megapixel camera sensor. And that's a cap lens made by Keks, K-E-K-S. It's a focus-free lens. Basically, it's a single lens from those old Kodak cheap cameras. It's a 30mm f10 aperture lens. You don't have any focus. It's focus-free. You don't have any means to change the aperture, but it's super cheap. It's basically a cap with a small lens in it. And that's the first test I've done. It's surprisingly defined, precise. I like the rendering. Again, it's an f10, so yeah, low light. I tried to push the equipment. The SL2 is pretty good in low lights, but still here you have a long exposure. I'm using the stabilization, the IBIS, basically to its limits. But you get some really interesting stuff with that kind of lens. So interesting. I'll probably do a video about it separately. Going back to digicam, going back to the early days of digital photography, of affordable digital photography. That's a Minolta Dimage EX 1 megapixel camera. It's got very special things to it. I'll do a special video about it, but it's interesting. I tried to push it in low lights. At the time, didn't have RAW file format. You only have JPEG, so that's JPEG. But I find it very interesting the way it renders colors and codes it. The sensor is interesting. Two examples of the tries I've done with it. Next, again, a digicam. That's a Minox digital classic camera, Leica M3 Plus. Basically looks like a toy camera with a tiny sensor, a manual focus lens, and yeah, I've had this camera for a long time. the sensor has a really weird way of rendering, which I find actually pretty interesting. So I'm going to do a video about it. I've been using it last month a little bit more in that perspective. Yeah. Then we go to film. That's using a Voigtlander Bessa M camera, basically for street photography. With I didn't put any viewfinder on it. It's basically meant to take pictures, street photography or whatever. I was trying this camera and seeing how it rendered, and that's with Cine Still XX film, black and white film. I have, however, no idea what sensitivity I put the film at. Probably 400. Not sure. It's a film you can definitely set at between 100 and 400 with no problems. But yeah, two examples of the rendering of this camera. I'll do something about it more specific in the future. And both photos are in Geneva, just roaming around. Here's something really different in terms of film. That's long expired Kodak 3200 ISO T-Max using a really good camera in terms of exposition. There's a video on the channel about it. It's the Minolta CLE. So it's not the exposition the problem. Actually, it is, but it's the camera's not the problem. That was I have no idea what lens I used, but I kind of liked the result. Very grainy. T-Max is very grainy in general, but I definitely underexposed it. I tried to compensate a little bit, but obviously not enough or not in the right way. But the results were interesting. And yeah, it's that's things I like to experiment with. Very, very weird results. But yeah, that's always expired film is very interesting often because you're taking risks when you take the picture. You have to be ready for the unexpected, and that was kind of unexpected. Again, going to something else that's part of another project I have, using an X-Band 2 camera, which lets you take the Hasselblad X-Band 2 camera, lets you take panoramic pictures, but also full frame 24 by 36 format photos on the same roll, and that's ADOX CMS22 film, a very fine grained film. Here, definitely the rendering is what I wanted. The film is really able to go way beyond what you're seeing here. I'm out of focus here, low speeds, and it's a low ISO film, but that's part of a project I have, and that was the next picture actually. Same thing, same film, same camera, but in panoramic view. That's in Iceland. As I've said in previous videos, I tend to fill some cameras with films that I don't finish for months. And that was the last big eruption in Iceland. And I took that picture in that context and really trying to get that eerie feel. Very dusty films, as always with me. I don't really care about that. That's part of my process. But very interesting film, very precise. And yeah, I got what I wanted. But yeah, that's part of my last month's discoveries. And here we're going to something else. For those who follow my Matnum digital photography, matière numérique, digital matter videos series, when I use phones, I like the format, the 1x2 format, and that's a Lenovo Technorama camera, medium format. It's 6x12 using 120 film. That's Ilford Delta 3200 ISO, expired actually. And it has here, it's kind of a big medium format camera. And I wanted to experiment with the same format that I use usually in digital. I like it more in portrait view than in landscape, but here I was trying to get acquainted to the camera. So here it's using a super Angular 65mm f5.6 lens. And yeah, interesting experience. I a little bit messed up when I put the film inside, so you can see there's some markings on the left of the image, but really interesting camera to use. It's definitely not the same process as using a light camera like the X-Pan. And here's at the same place. I had the X-Pan at the same time. Took also a panoramic view. Here I digitized negative. I didn't do the mirroring, so this one's actually mirrored in the wrong way. But that's using the X-Pan with some Electra Flick Film Electra 100 ISO. It's basically Kodak Aero color film spooled in 35mm canisters. Really interesting film. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but yeah, that interesting. I would recommend you try yourself experimenting, sometimes having two cameras and try to do the same thing with different equipment. Equipment definitely matters, no matter what anyone says. Here, new film, Cine Still 400D by Cine Still. Supposed to be a new emulsion. So as you can see, that's using the Olympus XA rangefinder, tiny rangefinder camera, which I often use. You can see those glows from the usual glows you would find on Cine Still 800. You find it here, a little bit different, but in high contrast zones on the picture on the right. But otherwise, it's really, as you can see on the left, the color rendering, the definition, the way it renders. It's definitely movie-meant film, Vision 3 from Kodak, obviously, without the ramjet. But yeah, really good rendering. And because it's becoming quite fashionable, those kind of films, there's other companies in Cine Still that do it. So I wanted to try the Oasca 800T. It's another company that also removes the ramjet before exposition, and that enables you then to develop using C41 processes, not the ECN process that is usually meant for Cine film. And that's using the Minolta CLE, a Summicron 50mm f2.0, and in Oslo. Night photography. I wasn't able really to find a significant difference with Cine Still 800 film. It's obviously the same film, but maybe one could expect that the process of removing the ramjet might be different. But anyways, the results were what I expected from that kind of film. Again, 2 images with this film. So yeah, and here's that's with Summarit-M 90mm lens. I'm not sure there's a big difference between Cine Still and the Oasca film. At least it gives us options to get the film in terms of, I don't know, cost or availability. It's always good to have more availability. And here, going back to this Aero color film that I'm trying to use, which is sold by Flick Film Electra 100. That's on a new camera I was experimenting with, the Rolei XF35, a small rangefinder camera from Rolei. Very popular at the time, and I was very surprised. There'll be a video about that camera and also about that film, but this combination was surprisingly very successful for me. Really enjoyable to use, and the results were. I've rarely had such a rate of usable pictures. Anyways, I'll talk about this in another video, but here are some examples. On the left, that's in Zurich, right, that's in Oslo, using this film. Very interesting rendering, and the camera was really a delight to use. And then going back to something else, often that's something I always would recommend. Obviously not for some project that you really well-defined projects you have, but if you have some cameras laying around, film cameras, don't hesitate to put films in it and let them grow. So I always have some films that I don't finish for months, and here that was a good surprise psychologically. Some sun. In January, I developed this film finally and discovered I had some photos I had forgotten about them. That's in Marseille, summertime, and that's using Cine Still 50D with a Summarit-M lens. I don't know, maybe 35mm or 50mm. Not that sure. I think 50 on the left, maybe 50 on both. I don't know. But this really specific rendering of the Cine Still 50D, really precise, using a Leica M8. And 2 last photos, same equipment, with a little bit of sun and warmth. Yeah. Hopefully that wasn't too long. I hope you enjoyed. If you have comments or questions, don't hesitate. And yeah, hopefully see you next time.